A ruthless CEO at the top of his game, Marcus King built his empire with cold precision, cutting off anything, or anyone, that got in his way. But one phone call shatters his perfect world. His ex-lover is dead. A newborn baby, claimed to be his, is left behind, and the truth about her mother will destroy everything he thought he knew. As Marcus fights to escape the chaos, he uncovers shocking secrets, buried betrayals, and a devastating revelation that will leave him questioning his own bloodline. Will he walk away, or will he become the father he never thought he could be? Before we dive in, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. Marcus King had everything: a multi-million-dollar consulting firm, a penthouse with a skyline view, and the kind of power that made men twice his age envious. He was precise, disciplined, and completely in control. Every decision, every deal, every second of his life was calculated. There was no room for mistakes, no room for distractions, and certainly no room for regret. The evening started like any other. Marcus sat at his glass desk overlooking the city, reviewing projections for his next expansion. His assistant had long since gone home, and the only sound in his office was the low hum of the air conditioning. He liked it that way, silent, orderly, predictable. But then his phone rang. He almost ignored it. Business calls after 9 were rarely important, and personal calls were non-existent. But something about the number flashing on the screen made him pause. It was unfamiliar, yet local. A hospital. His brows furrowed as he picked up. "Mr. King?" The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "I'm calling from St. Vincent's. Do you know a Jasmine Reed?" The name hit him like a slow, twisting knife. Jasmine. It had been years. A woman he once cared for, maybe even loved, though he had never let himself admit it. He had walked away from that relationship without looking back, consumed by his ambition. "Yes," he said carefully, his grip tightening on the phone. "Why?" The silence before the next words felt like a lifetime. "I'm sorry to inform you that she passed away earlier this evening. A sudden aneurysm. There was nothing we could do." Marcus's chest tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I see," he said, swallowing the strange lump in his throat. I'm sorry to hear that. There's something else," the nurse continued. "She gave birth a few days ago. A baby girl. You're listed as the father on the birth certificate." The words knocked the air from his lungs. "That's not possible," he said automatically. "Mr. King, we need you to come in. The baby has no one else. If you don't claim her, she'll be placed in foster care." Marcus barely registered the rest of the conversation. He numbly agreed to come by, though his mind was already racing ahead. It had to be a mistake. Jasmine would have told him. She wasn't reckless, she wasn't manipulative, and yet she was gone. And there was a baby, his baby, alone in a hospital waiting for someone to claim her. He ended the call, staring at his reflection in the dark window. His perfect life, his carefully structured world had just cracked down the middle. Minutes later, he grabbed his coat. Stepping into the cold night, he told himself he was only going to clear up a misunderstanding. But deep down, something told him this was only the beginning. Marcus pulled into the hospital parking lot just past midnight, the city's glow reflecting off his windshield. He sat there for a moment, hands gripping the wheel, trying to push down the uneasy weight pressing against his chest. This was absurd. It had to be a mistake. And yet, he had driven all the way here, his gut twisting with something that felt too much like guilt. Inside, the hospital was eerily quiet, save for the occasional voice over the intercom. A nurse at the front desk glanced up as he approached. "Marcus." "King?" he said, voice firm. "I got a call about a baby." The words felt foreign on his tongue, like they didn't belong to him. The nurse's expression softened. "Yes, Mr. King. Right this way." She led him through a set of double doors, past rows of rooms filled with patients. The air smelled of antiseptic and something too clean, too sterile. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs with every step. Finally, they stopped in front of a small room. Inside, an incubator sat beneath the dim light, a tiny figure curled up. Inside, the nurse stepped aside, giving him space to move closer. Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure what he expected. Some instant recognition, some undeniable connection that would erase all doubt. But as he looked down at the baby, she was just small, fragile. A pink hospital blanket swaddled her, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. A full head of dark curls framed her delicate face. "She's been doing well," the nurse said gently. "No complications from birth. She's perfectly healthy." Marcus exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. "There has to be a mistake. Jasmine never told me she was pregnant." The nurse nodded as if she had heard this before. "It happens more than you think, but her birth certificate lists you as the father. You can take a paternity test to be sure." Marcus swallowed, his throat dry. He should walk away, handle this like a business transaction. confirm the truth, make arrangements, move on. But then the baby stirred, a soft whimper escaping. Her lips, his body tensed, and then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he reached out. His hand hovered over her for a second before finally resting against the edge of the incubator. The baby's tiny fingers twitched, then curled slightly. Marcus barely breathed. He had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, stood toe-to-toe with the most ruthless men in the industry, and yet this moment left him shaken in a way he didn't understand. Her name is Ava, the nurse added. Jasmine named her before she passed. Ava. Marcus closed his eyes just for a second. When he opened them again, there was no escaping the truth. Mistake or not, this child had no one, and for reasons he couldn't explain, that fact unsettled him more than anything else ever had. Marcus sat stiffly in the hospital chair, staring at the paperwork in front of him. Legal documents, temporary custody forms, medical reports, lines of text blurring together in the fluorescent light. He had signed countless contracts in his life, but this felt different. This wasn't a deal. This wasn't about money. This was a decision that would change everything. Ava lay in a hospital bassinet beside him, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the chaos her existence had thrown into his life. He had agreed to a paternity test. He needed proof before making any permanent choices, but the results would take days. In the meantime, the hospital needed someone to take her home. There was no next of kin. No one else had come forward. "Are you sure you don't need more time to decide?" the nurse asked, her voice gentle. Marcus clenched his jaw. "No." He grabbed the pen and signed his name with practiced ease. "I'll take her." The words felt foreign, unnatural, but final. The next few hours were a blur. The hospital staff walked him through Ava's care, feeding, burping, diaper changes, but it was all noise to him. He absorbed nothing. His mind was stuck in one endless loop. What the hell am I doing? By the time he carried Ava out of the hospital, bundled tightly in a tiny pink blanket, he felt like he was walking into a life that wasn't his own. The drive home was silent, save for Ava's soft breaths. He had made this trip 1,000 times, but never like this. His sleek, meticulously maintained penthouse had never seemed so cold, so unfit for a child. The moment he stepped inside, he realized just how unprepared he was. He set Ava's car seat down carefully on the kitchen counter, staring at her like she was some puzzle he didn't know how to solve. She stirred, then let out a small cry. Panic gripped his chest. "Shh," he muttered, awkwardly unbuckling her and lifting her into his arms. He had seen people do this before. It couldn't be that hard, right? Ava's cries only grew louder. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling under the surface. What was he supposed to do? He tried rocking her. Nothing. He checked her diaper. Dry. He grabbed the formula the hospital had given him, fumbling with the instructions. His hands, usually so steady, felt clumsy. By the time he managed to get the bottle together and warm, the milk, Ava was screaming at full volume. His chest tightened. He had closed billion-dollar deals, managed hundreds of employees, built a life of absolute control, and yet, standing in his kitchen, holding a tiny, helpless baby, he had never felt more lost. Finally, after what felt like forever, Ava latched onto the bottle, her cries fading into soft gulps. Marcus exhaled, his grip loosening slightly. He had no idea what he was doing, and for the first time in his life, that terrified him. Marcus sat at the edge of his bed, exhaustion pressing into his bones. It had been 2 days since he brought Ava home, and his once perfectly controlled life had become a disaster. His penthouse, always immaculate, was now littered with baby supplies he barely knew how to use. His sleep, what little he got, was broken by Ava's relentless cries at all hours of the night. His usual morning routine, a rigid schedule of gym, coffee, and work, had been replaced with bottle feedings, diaper changes, and frantic Google searches about why babies wouldn't stop crying. His phone vibrated on the nightstand. A message from his assistant. 3 urgent meetings rescheduled. Call me ASAP. He sighed, rubbing his temples. He had barely looked at his work in 2 days and already things were slipping. He had built his company from the ground up, demanded perfection, expected it from himself and everyone around him. And yet here, he was in wrinkled clothes, hair a mess, struggling to function because of an 8-pound baby. Ava stirred in the bassinet beside him, her tiny fingers flexing as she made a soft sound, somewhere between a sigh and a whimper. Marcus's body tensed instinctively, ready for another round of screaming, but she remained asleep. For a moment, he just watched her. She was so small, so fragile. He had spent his entire life focused on power and control, but this child, she was completely powerless, utterly dependent on him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He carefully stood and made his way to the entrance. opening it to find his lawyer, Ryan Marshall, standing there, briefcase in hand. "You look like hell," Ryan said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Marcus shut the door. "I feel worse." Ryan smirked but quickly sobered. The paternity test results came in. Marcus's stomach clenched. He had been waiting for this, needing to know the truth. His hands flexed at his sides as Ryan pulled out the envelope and handed it to him. The silence in the room stretched as Marcus tore it open. His eyes scanned the page, taking in the bold words staring back at him. Probability of paternity, 0%. He wasn't her father. His grip on the paper tightened. Ryan cleared his throat. "I assume this changes things." Marcus's jaw clenched. It should change things. It should mean he was free to step away, to let someone else deal with this mess. But, as he glanced at Ava, sleeping soundly in the bassinet, something in his chest twisted. "She has no one else," he murmured. Ryan frowned. "Marcus, you don't owe her anything." He knew that, and yet he folded the paper, set it down, and exhaled slowly. "I'm keeping her," he said. Ryan blinked. "Are you sure?" Marcus looked at Ava again. "Yeah," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'm sure." Marcus wasn't sure when his life had become a blur of baby bottles, late-night cries and sleep deprivation, but here he was, standing in his penthouse at 4 a.m, holding a screaming infant against his chest, and wondering how the hell he had gotten here. Ava's tiny body wriggled in his arms, her face red with frustration as she wailed into his ear. He had already tried everything. Feeding? She wasn't hungry. Diaper? Already changed. Rocking her? He'd been doing it for what felt like hours. He exhaled sharply, pacing the living room. "What do you want, kid?" he muttered. "Tell me what I'm doing wrong." Ava kept crying, unconcerned with his growing frustration. His phone vibrated on the counter, and he barely glanced at it before swiping to answer. "You sound like you're in hell," Ryan's voice came through, far too amused for Marcus's liking. "I'm in worse than hell," Marcus muttered, rubbing his forehead. "How do people do this? How do they function? Most people aren't single. Fathers with billion-dollar companies to run," Ryan said dryly. "Speaking of which, your investors are getting nervous. You've missed 3 meetings. People are asking questions." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. He had never been that guy, the one who missed calls, who let things slide. His life had been built on discipline, efficiency, control, but control didn't exist here, not with Ava. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice sharp. "You sure? Because if this is too much, there are other options." "I said I'll handle it." Ryan sighed but didn't argue. "All right, but I'd suggest getting some help. A nanny, at the very least. You're drowning, man." Marcus ended the call without responding. Ava's cries finally quieted, her small body relaxing against his chest as he continued pacing. He looked down at her, watching as she blinked up at him sleepily, her tiny hand curling against his shirt. She trusted him, completely, and for some reason, that terrified him more than anything else. The next morning, Marcus sat in his office, Ava asleep in a bassinet beside him. He had no idea if bringing her to work was a terrible idea, but he had no choice. There was no one else. His assistant Claire stood by the door, her expression carefully neutral. "You don't have to say it," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Say what?" "That I look like a man who hasn't slept in a week and has no idea what he's doing." Claire smiled. "I wasn't going to say that, but I was going to suggest hiring a professional." Marcus sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I don't want a stranger raising her." "Then don't hire a stranger," Claire said simply. "Hire someone you can trust." Marcus glanced at Ava, sleeping soundly for once. Maybe Claire was right. Maybe he couldn't do this alone. Marcus sat on the floor of his living room, Ava cradled in one arm while he scrolled through a list of highly recommended nannies on his tablet. Claire had sent over vetted candidates, each with glowing reviews and years of experience. Any logical person would have picked one and moved on, but Marcus hesitated. Hiring a nanny was the smart thing to do. It would free up his time, let him focus on work, and give Ava the care she needed from someone who actually knew what they were doing. Yet every time he imagined handing her over to a stranger, something in his chest tightened. Ava let out a soft sigh against his chest, her tiny fingers grasping his shirt. He exhaled. "I should have just hired someone on day one, huh?" She didn't respond, obviously, but the moment stretched between them, an unspoken weight settling on his shoulders. Setting the tablet aside, Marcus glanced at the unopened box of jasmines, things sitting in the corner. The hospital had given it to him the day he took Ava home, but he hadn't touched it. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear of what he'd find inside. Finally, he reached for it. The lid came off easily, revealing neatly folded clothes, a small bag of makeup, and a few framed pictures. The sight of Jasmine's face, frozen in time, sent a sharp pang through him. She had always been beautiful, effortlessly so, confident, stubborn, He had admired that about her, even when they clashed. Digging deeper, he found a small stack of letters, tied together with a thin ribbon. He frowned, pulling them out. The top one had his name on it. Marcus, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know if I'll have the courage to send it. But there are things I should have told you. Things I've been too afraid to say. He swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the letter. I wanted to tell you about Ava, I really did. But I kept thinking, what if you didn't want this? What if I told you and it ruined everything? I convinced myself it was better this way, that I was protecting both of us. But now, I don't know. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I hope if you ever do read this, you won't hate me. I hope you'll understand. Jasmine. Marcus stared at the words, his mind spinning. He didn't know whether to feel anger or grief. She had been afraid of him, afraid of what he would do. And maybe, just maybe, she had been right to be. Ava stirred in his arms, pulling him back to the present. He glanced down at her, at the tiny life she had left behind. Jasmine had made her choice. Now, it was up to him to make his. Marcus couldn't shake the weight of the letter. It stayed with him, an anchor dragging him deeper into questions he didn't want to ask. Jasmine had hidden things from him, things that mattered, and if she had been willing to keep a secret as big as Ava, what else had she never told him? He needed answers. The next morning he made a call. Find out everything you can about Jasmine Reed, he told his private investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Lillian Sharp. Her last few years, her finances, the people she kept close, and I want to know if there's any chance she was involved with someone else before she died. Lillian didn't ask questions. That was why he trusted her. I'll get back to you within the week. Marcus hung up and exhaled slowly, glancing toward Ava, who sat in a baby rocker near his desk. She was wide awake, staring at him with those deep brown eyes that made something unfamiliar twist inside him. He had spent his life analyzing risk, predicting outcomes, controlling every variable. But there was nothing predictable about this. He had no blueprint for raising a child, no strategy for dealing with the ghost of a woman he had once loved. The week passed in a blur of work, sleepless nights, and an endless cycle of feedings and diaper changes. But underneath it all, tension simmered, waiting for Lillian's call. When it finally came, Marcus answered before the first ring finished. You were right to be suspicious, Lillian said. Jasmine was keeping a secret, a big one. Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. Go on. Ava isn't yours, I mean biologically. He closed his eyes. I already know that. You might, but do you know who her real father is? Something cold slithered down his spine. Who? Lillian hesitated. Your brother, Elijah King. Marcus stilled, the world narrowing into a single point of focus. Elijah. The name hit like a punch to the gut. It had been years since they had spoken. Years since their last explosive fight that had ended with fists and broken glass. Elijah had been the reckless one, the one who had thrown away opportunities, burned bridges, ruined everything their family had built. Marcus had cut him off, written him out of his life like an unbalanced equation, and now he was Ava's father. His jaw clenched. Are you sure? Positive. There are financial records. Jasmine had been receiving money from him sporadically. Not much, but enough to suggest he was involved. I also found some old photos of them together. It wasn't just a fling. Marcus stared at the wall, his thoughts a storm of rage, betrayal, and something dangerously close to grief. Jasmine had loved Elijah, or at least she had been with him, and she had still chosen to leave Ava with him. The question burned in his mind. Why? Marcus gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind buzzed with everything Lillian had told him, but one thought rose above the rest. Elijah, his brother, his enemy, the man he hadn't spoken to in years, Ava's real father. The city blurred past his windows as he drove toward the last known address Lillian had dug up, a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the life they had once shared. Marcus had always been the disciplined one, the success story, while Elijah had been the reckless screw-up, the one who squandered every opportunity. Now Elijah had a daughter, and he didn't even know it. Marcus parked and stepped out, his polished shoes feeling out of place against the cracked pavement. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder. The door creaked open and there he was. Elijah looked nothing like the man Marcus remembered. His once sharp features were worn down, his jaw rough with stubble. His eyes, the same deep brown as Ava's, flickered with surprise before hardening. Well, Elijah drawled, leaning against the doorframe. Didn't think I'd ever see you again. Marcus didn't waste time. We need to talk. Now, Elijah smirked, but there was no humor in it. Not sure what we have to talk about. Marcus shoved the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was small, cluttered, smelling faintly of alcohol and stale air. Elijah sighed and shut the door behind them. All right, let's hear it. What brings Mr. Perfect to my doorstep? Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling to a picture of Ava. He turned the screen toward Elijah. Her. Elijah's expression shifted, his smirk vanishing. His eyes locked onto the screen. Something raw flickering across his face. He swallowed. Who is that? You tell me, Marcus said, voice tight. Her name is Ava, Jasmine's daughter. Elijah went still. His breath hitched. Jasmine. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. I didn't know. She's yours, Elijah, Marcus said, each word sharp as a blade. And she's been alone since Jasmine died. Elijah flinched at that, his shoulders tensing. For the first time, Marcus saw something break in him. She never told me, Elijah murmured, his voice hoarse. She never said a word. Marcus studied him, searching for any sign of a lie. He found none, and for a moment the anger wavered. Elijah turned away, gripping the back of a chair as if he needed something to steady himself. He shook his head. I don't know what to say. Marcus crossed his arms. Then figure it out, because she's waiting. Elijah looked back at him, something heavy in his gaze. For the first time in years, they weren't just brothers. They were two men standing at the edge of something far bigger than either of them. Elijah sat on the edge of his worn-out couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight as if he were holding himself together. Marcus stood across from him, arms crossed, his posture rigid. The silence between them stretched thick and suffocating. You should have been there, Marcus finally said, his voice controlled but seething. You should have known. Elijah exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. You think I wouldn't have stepped up if I knew? You think I would have left Jasmine alone to deal with this? Marcus scoffed. I don't know what you would have done. That's the problem. Elijah's jaw tightened. You think I'm some kind of deadbeat? You are a deadbeat, Marcus shot back. You walked away from everything, Elijah. You burned bridges, you wrecked your life, and now you're telling me I should believe you'd suddenly step up for a child? Elijah's nostrils flared, but he didn't argue. That silence, the lack of denial, only infuriated Marcus more. You don't get it, Elijah muttered. Jasmine was the best thing that ever happened to me, and I ruined it, just like I ruin everything. Marcus frowned, caught off guard by the rare honesty in his brother's voice. Elijah leaned forward, his fingers gripping his hair. I loved her, man. I loved her. And when things got hard, when I couldn't get my life together, I thought maybe the best thing I could do for her was walk away before I dragged her down with me. Marcus clenched his jaw, his anger faltering. It was easy to hate Elijah, to see him as nothing but a screw-up. But this was something else. She chose me to take care of Ava, Marcus said after a long pause. Not you. Elijah flinched. The words landed heavy, undeniable. I know, Elijah murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. And I hate myself for it. For the first time in years, Marcus saw his brother not as the reckless kid who had ruined everything, but as a man carrying his own regrets. But that didn't change the reality of the situation. You want her? Marcus asked, his voice colder now. You want to be her father? Elijah swallowed hard, lifting his gaze. She's mine. Then prove it. Elijah's eyes narrowed. What the hell does that mean? Marcus stepped forward, unflinching. It means I'm not handing her over to you. Just because you suddenly feel guilty? You think you deserve her? You think you can just walk in and be a dad because you want to be? He shook his head. Fatherhood isn't about what you deserve, Elijah. It's about what you do. Elijah stared at him, breathing heavy. You want her, Marcus continued, then fight for her. The challenge hung between them, and for the first time in his life, Elijah didn't back down. The courtroom was colder than Marcus expected, all polished wood and sharp edges, designed to strip emotion from the moment. But there was no stripping the tension from this. He sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded, expression unreadable. Across from him, Elijah sat stiff-backed, his face set in quiet determination. The judge, an older woman with a keen gaze, glanced at the file in front of her before addressing the room. We are here today to determine the custody of Ava Reed. Mr. Marcus King has been the child's guardian since the passing of her mother, Jasmine Reed. Mr. Elijah King has filed for full parental custody, claiming biological paternity. Marcus's jaw tightened. Hearing it laid out like that, as if it were just another business dispute, made his stomach churn. Elijah's lawyer stood first. Your Honor, my client was unaware of his daughter's existence until recently. Had he known, he would have taken full responsibility from the beginning. Blood ties matter. A child deserves to be raised by their real father. Marcus kept his expression neutral, but the words struck a nerve. Real father. He had spent sleepless nights holding Ava, calming her cries, feeding her when she was too small to understand the world around her. And now, just like that, Elijah thought he could claim her. His own lawyer rose. Your Honor, Marcus King has been the sole provider for Ava since her mother's passing. He has given her stability, a home, and unwavering care. A biological connection does not automatically make someone a father. Parental rights must be earned through action, not just DNA. The judge turned to Marcus. "Mr. King, do you wish to say anything?" Marcus stood, smoothing his suit, though his pulse pounded in his ears. "Your Honor, I built my life on control, on making calculated decisions, on never letting emotions cloud my judgment. But when I found out about Ava, I had a choice, to walk away or to stay. I stayed, not because I was obligated to, but because I chose to, because she needed someone and I was the only one left." He turned to face Elijah. "I don't doubt that my brother cares for her, that he wants to be a good father, but I've been there. Through every sleepless night, through every moment of doubt and fear. He wants the title. I've done the work." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't interrupt. Marcus took a breath, steadying himself. "Ava is my daughter, maybe not by blood, but in every way that matters, and I won't let her become another one of Elijah's mistakes." The judge was silent for a long moment before she finally spoke. "I have heard both arguments. Given the stability provided and the best interest of the child, I am granting full custody to Marcus King." Elijah exhaled sharply, his head dropping. Marcus stayed standing, his heartbeat hammering. He had won, but why didn't it feel like a victory? Marcus sat in the nursery, the soft glow of the nightlight casting long shadows against the walls. Ava was asleep in his arms, her tiny fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. The court battle was over. He had won. Ava was legally his. And yet, the victory felt hollow. He had spent his life believing that winning was all that mattered, that success was measured in control, in numbers, in the ability to outmaneuver anyone who stood in his way. But today, when the gavel came down, and the judge ruled in his favor, he hadn't felt triumph. He had felt something else. Guilt. Elijah had barely said a word when the ruling was announced. He had just nodded, stood up, and walked out. No fight, no argument, just a quiet resignation that made something uneasy settle in Marcus's chest. Because Elijah had lost Ava before he ever even got the chance to know her. Marcus exhaled, adjusting Ava slightly as she stirred. She was getting bigger, stronger. A part of him wondered if she would grow up and one day ask about Elijah, about why her real father wasn't around. Would she resent him for keeping them apart? Would she ever understand why he had fought so hard to keep her? His phone vibrated on the nightstand. He reached for it carefully, making sure not to disturb Ava. A text from Elijah, "Meet me tomorrow. No lawyers, no bullshit, just us." Marcus stared at the message for a long time before finally typing back, "Where?" The reply came almost instantly. Jasmine's grave. Noon. Marcus felt a familiar tension settle between his shoulders. He had been avoiding that place. Maybe because it made things too real. Maybe because there were too many things left unsaid. But now, with everything out in the open, maybe it was time to face it. The next afternoon, Marcus arrived at the cemetery to find Elijah already there, standing in front of Jasmine's headstone with his hands in his pockets. The air was heavy, with silence. "You came," Elijah said without looking up. Marcus stepped forward, stopping a few feet away. "You asked?" Elijah let out a slow breath. "I didn't fight hard enough, did I?" Marcus didn't answer right away. "You fought as hard as you could," Elijah scoffed. "That's just a nice way of saying I lost." Marcus looked at the headstone, at the name etched into the stone. "Jasmine trusted me to take care of her, to take care of Ava. That's why I fought." Elijah nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I just wanted to know her, that's all." Marcus hesitated, then spoke before he could second-guess himself. "You still can." Elijah turned to him, eyes sharp with surprise. Marcus met his gaze. "If you're serious, if you're ready." For the first time in years, Elijah nodded, and Marcus nodded back. The sun was beginning to set as Marcus walked through the park, Ava cradled against his chest. The air was warm, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant laughter of children playing. It had been months since the custody battle, months since Elijah had walked away from that courtroom with nothing, but he hadn't disappeared. True to his word, Elijah had started showing up, not all at once, not in a way that disrupted Ava's life, but in small, careful steps. Coffee meetings, brief visits, moments where he sat across from Marcus, learning about the daughter he had never known. He wasn't perfect, and he had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus saw something different in his brother: effort. Now, as he approached a park bench, he found Elijah already there, hands in his pockets, looking uncertain. It was still strange seeing him like this, not reckless, not angry, just trying. Marcus sat beside him, adjusting Ava in his arms as she stirred. Elijah looked at her with quiet longing, then met Marcus's gaze. "You still sure about this?" Marcus studied him for a long moment before nodding. Yeah, Elijah exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. I don't know how to do this, man. I don't know how to be what she needs. Neither did I, Marcus admitted. But I figured it out, and so will you. Elijah hesitated, then reached out carefully. Marcus didn't stop him as he lifted Ava into his arms for the first time. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ava blinked up at Elijah, her tiny fingers curling around the fabric of his shirt. And just like that, something in Elijah's face shifted, something raw and unguarded. He let out a shaky breath, holding her like she was the most fragile thing in the world. She's perfect, he whispered. Marcus watched them, something settling in his chest. There had been a time when he never would have allowed this, never would have trusted Elijah to be in Ava's life. But people changed. Maybe not all at once, maybe not in ways they expected, but they could change. And for the first time, Marcus was willing to believe that Elijah had. Ava let out a small, contented sound, and Elijah let out a quiet laugh. Marcus smirked. She likes you. Elijah shook his head, still in awe. She doesn't even know me. Not yet, Marcus said, but she will. The two brothers sat in silence, watching the sun sink lower over the park, the golden light casting long shadows. For the first time in years, there was no resentment between them, no anger, no competition, just a promise. Ava had lost her mother, but she would never have to question if she was loved, not with both of them there to make sure of it. And for Marcus, that was enough.